topic I know we wanted to talk about is this was actually something we covered a couple months ago when it was just kind of being talked about, but now it's actually happened. Is that uh, Chinese companies are going back to the Mao Zedong era, and they now have their own militias. Personally, I don't see this as a Mao Zedong thing. I think they're just all video game nerds and are, celebrating the upcoming release of the Final Fantasy VII remake, which obviously has the Shinra Corporation that has its own military soldier.
Yeah, Shelley knows that, obviously.
I've never played Final Fantasy.
I mean,
yeah.
Hey, next stream.
There's a lot of dystopian future video games or movies or TV shows where, the world or cities are controlled by essentially giant corporations with private armies. And that is kind of what we're seeing happening in China. But the key difference is that these militias are not just controlled by those corporations. They're mostly state-owned corporations, right? But they're also controlled by the Communist Party. It's kind of this dual control.
Yeah, it still backs the state ultimately instead of just like power to these individual companies.
Right. So if the Communist Party gives instructions, they have to follow them. And some people are like concerned that this is basically building up China's army against foreign adversaries. But
really,
that's probably not what's really going on.
I mean, it just seems like, would you build up the actual army instead of corporate militias?
Exactly. So like, what's the point of corporate militias?
I don't know. I mean, if we were really going to go back to the Mao era, then they would all kind of fight each other to see which one was the most loyal to Xi Jinping, right? Like the Red Guards. Yeah.
That could actually happen.
Yeah, but I mean, what's probably happening is that they're concerned about social unrest. And, when people protest, a lot of times the protests start over economic reasons. So
all the local governments that can't pay civil workers currently.
So it's like, I just, I just spent 2 years building this bridge and I'm owed like 12 months back pay, and where's my money? And the government doesn't have it. But what they do have is a militia. With a private construction company or whatever would have something that they could send in. It's more efficient than having to go to Beijing and be like, hey, would you mind sending tanks like 2,000 miles down to Henan and do this? Because remember, there was like those big bank protests there a couple of years ago.
Or I was just thinking even of like was it Evergrande? This is
the parking lot thing?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if it was the parking lot thing, but basically people were protesting. Like workers were protesting that they weren't getting their, I
remember something like that happening with Evergrande, and this is well before like the big.
Yeah, this is before like it actually started to collapse.
Right.
But if you have your workers like revolting inside your company, you send in your militia.
Exactly. I mean, I feel like this is a good, really fundamental solution to solve the underlying issues.
I mean, of course, we'll have to see how it's implemented, because it could just mean that like people have to, get up early and do weird drills or something like that. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, like if they make
it could
actual
just be the
workers do that?
Yeah.
You
volunteer to be part of the militia.
Good. Then you're training workers who could be discontent to do military drills and use weapons.
I mean, otherwise, what are you going to do? Maybe the people who are unemployed because they used to be the not the security workers, the COVID workers, the dabai, right? Like now,
that's an interesting idea.
People who need jobs.
A lot of those people were migrants too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you say migrants, you're talking about internal migrants.
Yeah, migrants in the sense of China, where like people will go from like the rural provinces to some of the bigger provinces to try and make some money.
Yeah, and I think the reason that they really are like migrants is that because of the Hukou system, you're either registered as country folk or as city folk. And
technical term.
Yes. And if the country folk want to go to the city, in some cases they can like live there temporarily and work in factories and stuff, but they don't actually have a household registration for the city. So like if they have kids there, the kids can't go to public school. They're not like official citizens of that city, of that urban area.
You can't get health care, certain services. So
so you basically are like it's almost like being an illegal immigrant in your own country, right? And so that system I mean, it was designed to keep, all these poor country folk from overrunning the cities. But
Ironic, huh?
yes. What do you mean?
Because that was Mao's whole thing. Use the periphery to surround the center, go to the countryside,
Oh,
get the people
yeah.
to rise up and take out the center.
Right.
It's almost like he's like, oh, that could be used against me.
Well,
Well,
I mean,
then
like,
that's when he started sending people from the city into the countryside.
Yes.
yes, that worked well, and your parents were super happy when it happened to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, although they didn't live in large cities, but they did both go down to the country. Oh, actually, they called it. It was like up to the mountains, down to the country, or something like that. And yep.
Yeah. So anyway, all the techniques and the things the CCP had said when they were rising to power, now they prevent anyone else from doing that.
But I do think it is interesting that we are seeing more and more like this return to Mao's era in many ways. I mean, there's been lots of comparisons between Xi Jinping and Mao for many years.
I think it's actually more tactical and less fundamental than a lot of analysts think. So a lot of people say, "Oh, Xi Jinping is like the worst dictator since Mao," and that misses the point that you had horrible, horrible things under Deng Xiaoping, like the Tiananmen massacre, under Jiang Zemin, like the killing of probably millions of Falun Gong practitioners, Hu Jintao and his whole destruction of Tibet, and he started the Uyghur stuff. So like there's been bad stuff happening this entire time, even during the period of economic reform, right? And so what we're seeing now is just that I think the economic reforms were in a certain political sense too much. So Xi Jinping's sort of tactic is to say, all right, well now let's go back to this type of control. But the CCP was always trying to keep things under control. It's just that now they need to do it more because of other problems that have arisen.
I mean, I kind of agree. I think what's happening is that essentially this is fundamentally a Marxist-Leninist system, right?
Right.
So like they never gave that up, even during the economic reforms. So like, what do you
Yeah, I mean,
have?
state-owned companies that are run by like the sons and daughters of party elites.
Yeah, I mean, all that really the economic like opening up did was essentially like keep the party from bankrupting the country, because there's like suddenly this influx of foreign capital, and then they, along with a lot of corruption. So now the party leaders and their families got wealthy,
Yeah.
right? So, but like fundamentally, the system didn't change. So,
Right.
what kind of tools do you have to maintain power? It is still like those Marxist-Leninist tools.
Right.
It's just more overt now. I mean,
Right.
people never stopped having to learn communist indoctrination in schools. Like these things didn't stop, but like it was just kind of like no one was really paying attention from the outside, because it was like, well, like nobody takes it seriously anymore. I mean, how many times have you heard, oh, well, like, okay, nobody believes in communism.
Right.
in
Even though
China
they're
anymore.
forced to study it in school, sometimes at work, in the military.
Right.
Yeah, and
time.
and like it's just this like in the West, this kind of like refusal to kind of engage with that, because it's like, oh well, like the Cold War's over,
It's the end of history. We're all the same. We
the
just want to make
Soviet
money.
Union's defeated, like it's not, nobody's communist anymore, and yeah.
Right. So now that one of the things that's made it more obvious in the last 10 years, especially 5 years, is social media, which is that, say, like in, I don't know, the early 2000s, when the Communist Party started like arresting all these Falun Gong people who were going to Beijing. And there was hardly any video or photos of the brutality that was enacted on people. No one was posting to social media like, oh, this is happening to me and my family right now, like, please help, in a live video or something. None of that, because it just wasn't, the technology wasn't there. And then once we get onto like the COVID era, for example, everybody has smartphones. Everyone's taking video of like how they're being locked down, how they're being
People breaking down
oppressed.
their doors.
Yeah, just like, and so the world is just so much more aware of this now. And I think that's also why, well, on one hand, it's good, right? Because we're all more aware. But on the other hand, the Communist Party now sees this as a bigger threat. So they have to switch tactics and crack down harder on all sorts of things and control all sorts of things to a greater degree.
I mean, it also, that same technology allows the CCP to track down, for example, those people who participated in the white paper protests against COVID, right? Like
Right.
they could pinpoint if your cell phone was in an area where the protests were happening,
You
and
don't
then
need
go,
the tanks. You can
Yeah,
just
you
go
can-
arrest them after the fact.
go arrest them 2 weeks later.
And that's what they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a great point. Like, it shows that the Chinese Communist Party is basically like a James Bond movie.
In what sense?
Well, since you know James Bond so well,
So I know what you're saying. Like, even though it's gone from Sean Connery to Roger Moore to Pierce Brosnan to Daniel Craig, it's the same
new face,
character.
same thing.
Exactly.
Oh,
yeah.
I see. Well, I'm
Same page.
I'm impressed by that. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
That analogy, or that Matt and I were on the same page?
No, the analogy, I guess.
Yeah.